Hey everyone, and welcome to another series of installation videos brought to you by Rockford Fosgate and the Rockford Technical Training Institute. In this series of videos, we're going to be taking a look at the installation process of our all-new audio system components for the Polaris Ranger side-by-side vehicles. So, without further ado, let's head inside and see how it's done. Alright guys, I am now joined by Brad with our new product development team, and he is going to help walk us through this installation of our Ranger Stage 4 audio kit. So Brad, what all comes in the kit?
For the Stage 4 kit, we're including our Ranger dash kit, our PMX2 source unit, front lower pods and speakers, subwoofer enclosure and subwoofer, our TM404 amplifier and all the wiring for that, as well as our rear cans and brackets.
All right, and the first thing we need to get this process started?
First thing we're gonna do is remove the hood and the upper dash panel.
All right, well, let's get going. All right, so now that Brad has the hood out of the way, we can go ahead and move on to removing the top dash panel. Now to do this, you're going to be removing the 4 pin rivets that are located along the top side of the dash. And to do this, we're going to be utilizing a special pin rivet removal tool. However, since you probably aren't going to have this in your toolbox, a flat blade screwdriver can also be used. Just remember to be careful when you do this so you don't break those pin rivets. Okay, so now with our top dash panel removed, we can now go ahead and remove the center pocket and switch panel assembly from the dash. To do this, we're going to take our T25 torque screwdriver and remove the 2 screws located at the bottom of the panel. This will allow us to pull the panel out and disengage the wiring harnesses from the factory switches. Once that's done, we're able to bring it here to the bench, start transferring those switches to our new PMX dash kit, and prepping it to receive the PMX2 radio. All right, so now that we have the OEM dash kit out of the vehicle and back here at the bench, we're ready to start prepping our replacement dash kit. So, Brad, is there anything special or that we need to do before we start assembling this?
Well, as you can see on this particular vehicle, we have 3 stock switches. Our dash kit, we have it set for 2, which is very common on the Ranger. So in this case, we're gonna go ahead and use the provided outline, cutting out our 3rd switch, and then we'll bring it back to the bench and get ready for the radio install.
All right, well, let's go see how that's done. All right, so now that we have our 3rd switch hole cut in the new dash kit, we're ready to go ahead and move our OE switches over to the new dash kit. To this, we're going to depress the locking tabs on the back side, slide them out, and simply snap them in. All right, so now as you can see, we have our switches transferred over to the new dash kit. Now, additionally, if your model also has the factory heater installed, we do have cutout lines for you to cut out the dash kit so you can transfer your heater controls over as well. At this point, we're ready to move on to our next step. So Brad, where do we go from here?
From here, we're going to go ahead and get out our PMX2 source unit, grab our adaptive brackets, and install it into our new dash kit.
All right, let's see how it's done.
Now that we're ready to install our PMX2 into our dash kit, we went ahead and got the rest of the parts we need. Now we got our adaptive bracket, wiring harness, zip ties and screws, and our firewall grommet. First thing we're going to do is mount our bracket into the dash kit and then our PMX2 into that. Now one thing to note, if you are using the heater kit in your Ranger, you're going to want to remove these two mounting screws off the back to allow the extra clearance. Now that we have our PMX2 mounted in our dash kit, we're going to drill a hole in the firewall to pass our wires through to the power block. Now we included a 1 3/4 inch grommet to fill the hole once you drill it. Now that we have our grommet in place, we're going to move on to installing our front lower pods. Now we include some screws that go into the factory bosses in the tray, and to make it easier, we're going to go ahead and thread them in first before installing the pod. It will just make it a little easier because they're going to be fresh threads. Now once we get those started, we'll pull them back out, put the pods in, put the 2 screws in, and then we'll be able to move on from there. Now that we have our front lower pods installed, we can go ahead and move on to putting the wiring in. Now once we get our wiring run through the pod, we're going to use our sealing pad to keep them airtight. Once we get those through, we're going to put our speakers in and move on from there.
All right guys, so now that we have our speaker pods and speakers installed and the wiring harness ran up into the dash, we're ready to move to the back of the vehicle to continue the installation. So Brad, what is the next thing that we're going to install?
The next thing we're going to install is our rear cans. Now the reason we're going to start with these next is we want to pull all the wiring forward. And when we go by the battery, we'll pick up our amplifier harness. We go by the front seat, we'll pick up our subwoofer harness as well. So when we move to the back, we're actually going to prep the inside by removing all the panels as well as the storage compartment that's going to be in our way.
All right, well, let's get started. Alright guys, before we get to the actual installation of the clamps and rear speaker assemblies, we want to take a second and kind of go over the clamp assembly itself. Because when you look at it, it's a little more complicated than our other model clamps that we have on the market. So Brad, I see this is a multi-piece clamp. What are we looking at here?
So basically with our clamp, we designed it for the Ranger style cage because it wasn't a round tube like the Razor. It had a little other problems to deal with.
Okay.
So what we came up with this 3-piece design that can be used on the inside or outside. So when you slide it on, you can actually take the center mount and put it to the outside of the vehicle if you like, or spin it around so the can goes towards the inside of the vehicle. It just has these key marks here that allows you to do that. Now when you install this, we also have the spot for the wire to come out. So as you can see, when you slide it in, you'll actually be able to bring the wire out through there. Now this hole in front of that is designed for our special Christmas tree style wire tie. You'll just pop it in a hole, put your wire through it, and tie it down tight. That way your wire's not flopping around. And when you're ready, the 2 pieces go together and fasten the 4 screws. And once it's in there, it won't move on your bar.
Okay. Now it's important that they position the hole facing forward because that's obviously the direction the wire is going to move or
Correct.
pathway.
Correct. You do want to make sure that you have your center piece of the clamp in the right orientation. You always want your wire facing towards the bar.
Now the other thing is once this is installed on the vehicle, it's just going to be locked onto the roll cage and you're ready to install the can. But prior to doing that, we recommend, of course, you want to run your wiring in place because it makes it a little easier to make the connection outside of this nipple area. So generally what we find works easiest is if you feed the 2-pin harness through the open hole to the outside of the clamp, pull through enough slack as you can see, and then feed it back through the center hole, like so. It gives you enough pigtail length on the outside that when this is in place, you can then have enough length to be able to plug into the 2-pin harness on top of the can assembly. Then you simply will pull the slack back through as you mount the can to the mounting post. And once that's in place, you can easily pull the slack back forward, giving you a nice tight configuration inside. Now also included in the kit will be a logo disc that will simply stick on to cover up the opening.
Now once you have these mounted on your new clamps, you may notice that the logo is sideways. Now what we've done is included a new disc with some double-side tape that you'll be able to mount however you see fit. So depending on what side you put the can on, you'll be able to affix this disc to make sure the logo is straight. And once that's done, like Rico said, we're ready to move on to the wiring.
All right guys, so now that we have our rear speaker wiring harnesses ran to the rear seat area, we're ready to continue installing the additional harnesses and get ready to run those forward. So Brad, what's the next harness that we need to go ahead and put in?
So the next harness we're going to worry about is the amplifier power harness. Now as you can see, it's all connected with the input and output as well. So what we're going to do is disconnect the remote wire temporarily just to make it easier to run.
Okay. And our plan is to run from the battery area, back seat area, picking up our rear speaker harnesses and run that forward into the rear seat and eventually into the dash area. Now, question is, can the customer, can they run it from back to front or front to back? Does it matter?
You can run it either way, but it is easier if you start at the battery and work your way forward. That way, if there's any extra slack, you can deal with it up front. and you can kind of determine which way you want to go. If you start from the front and go to the back, you may take a weird route and end up short and have to do it all over again.
Okay. And then once we get to the front seat area, then we're going to go ahead and run our subwoofer harness as well.
Correct. In this application, we're going to mount the subwoofer in the front seat. Now we can mount it in the rear as well, but with this application, we decided to go with the front. And once we get our rear speaker wires and our power harness to that front seat, we're going to grab our subwoofer harness and continue moving forward.
All right. Well, let's get it installed. All right, guys, so now that we have the wire harness run forward into the dash area, we're ready to go ahead and continue the installation process. So the next thing we want to do is go ahead and get the subwoofer and enclosure installed in the front seat area. Now, Brad, what do we have to do to prep the woofer to go in the car?
So to prep our woofer, we're going to wire the 2 coils in series so we can get a 4-ohm load since we ship it with a dual 2.
Okay, and how do we do that?
What we're going to do is flip it over, grab the included jumper wire, go from one side of the woofer's positive to the other side's negative. Just like that.
All right, and why is it important that we're wiring it as a 4-ohm line?
With our amplifier, we included the TM404. The output when it's bridged is best at a 4-ohm load.
Okay, so obviously this will match up with the amplifier.
Correct.
Okay, and now once we've got the voice coils wired together, what's the next step?
The next step we're going to do is install it to the enclosure itself, wiring up the remaining terminals before installing it. So we'll take our positive from our harness in the enclosure and the negative to the 2 open terminals that we have left. Once we have that done, we can go ahead and set it in the enclosure, mount it using the provided screws.
Now, one thing to note, you'll find that when you go to install the woofer, holes are already pre-drilled in the enclosure for you. It's important that you line the woofer mounting holes with these existing holes and not make new holes. New holes are, of course, going to create air gaps or areas where air can come out and in turn make the woofer not sound good. Additionally, when we drop this into the vehicle, you'll notice there are 3 primary mounting holes in the pre-installed flange. These will coincide with 3 mounting bolts that you'll find underneath the seat. Now, since this is a 4-seater or type vehicle, we've also included this additional plate. Now, what is this for?
So on the 4-seater, when you install this in the front seat, the storage bins are a different size than what you would be dealing with on a 2-seat or the rear seat of the 4-seater. So we included this bracket to help fill the gap that would be left due to the oversized bin.
Okay, so this really just installs on top of and creates an extension flange, if you will, to the center section, as you said, to fill that gap. So really you're just going to lay it on there, and then when you reinstall the 3 bolts, 2 of those bolts will align with these holes, locking it in place. I see we also have double-sided foam tape, so...
Correct. We included 4 small strips of foam tape just in case you were to have any rattles. Now, vehicle to vehicle, it may vary, and just depending on how much use you have on your vehicle. Being this is new, I doubt we're going to have any rattles. But after you get a few miles on the vehicle, the pockets tend to slide around a little bit and loosen up. So you can actually put these on the bottom side of the metal bracket just to keep things tight.
Okay, well, sounds pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and finish getting that woofer mounted and let's get it in the vehicle. All right, so now that we have the subwoofer enclosure connected in the vehicle and remounted underneath the seat using the 3 bolts that we already removed, we can move on to prepping the mounting plate and amplifier itself to get that in the vehicle. So Brad, tell us a little bit about how we need to install this.
So with this amplifier bracket, it's a little unique, as in we're using a tab on one side and not screws to hold the amplifier. So what you're going to do is this will be mounted in the car first using the 2 stock bolts that hold the steering column in place. Now once you get that mounted, you'll be able to take the amplifier, slide it underneath the tab, then aligning your screws on the other side. Now once all that's in place, you'll be able to connect your wires and get it playing from there.
Now when we go to install the amplifier, do we need to make sure that we position this in a certain way, or can it just go in either direction?
Yes, you're going to want to have it so the control panel is on the tab side. That way when your harness goes in, it'll align properly.
Okay, well let's see that go in.
Now that we have our amplifier mounting plate installed in the vehicle, we're ready to move on to the amplifier. Before installing it, we're going to go ahead and insert the input plugs just to make it easier when we go to mount it. One quick tip about the amplifier bracket. Now there's only 2 screws that you're going to be using to mount the amplifier. We recommend taking the screws, running them through the threads once or twice before putting the bracket in the car. That way it clears out any excess powder coat that might have got on the threads, and it'll make it easier for installing once you're in the car.
All right, so now that we have the amplifier mounting plate and the amplifier installed in the vehicle, ready to move on to the next step. So Brad, what's the next thing we need to do?
The next thing we're going to do is take our wires that we routed up front of the vehicle, put them through the grommet to get them on the inside of the dash. Now once we get there, we can start routing them into the appropriate locations.
Okay. Is there anything else that we need to go ahead and put in or route while we're doing this process?
Once we go ahead and fish the wires through the grommet to the inside of the vehicle, we can go ahead and take our PMX2 harness, take the power and ground wire, and fish those forward through the grommet so we can attach them to the power distribution block.
All right, well let's get that done. All right, so now that we have the harnesses routed through the grommet, we're ready to start making some of the final connections. The first thing that we're going to do is we want to reconnect the remote turn-on wire to the power terminal block where we disconnected it earlier on the amplifier harness. The other remote wire that we're going to make a connection to is between the PMX2 radio harness and the amplifier harness. This will provide the turn-on signal for the amplifier when the radio is activated. Additionally to that, what else do we need to connect, Brad?
At that point, we can go ahead and start connecting our rest of our harness to the amplifier itself. We'll need to connect the subwoofer wire that we ran forward, as well as the front and rear output signal for the speakers. Now once we get those connected, we can move over to the main harness area and connect our front and rear speaker wires to the amplifier harness as well.
Okay. And then lastly, we want to connect the power and ground connection for the PMX2 radio to the distribution block underneath the hood that we mentioned earlier. Now, in this instance on this vehicle, it only has a switched 12-volt power wire coming to the distribution block. Your vehicle may be different in that it may also have a dedicated ground wire. Because ours doesn't, we are going to be utilizing one of the mounting screws for the block for the ground terminal point, because it goes directly to the chassis of the vehicle. Alright, so while Brad's finishing up the last of the connections in the dash area, we're at a point we're ready to go ahead and install our PMX2 radio and dash kit. Now when we go to do the installation, we're going to start by reconnecting the factory switches first, just simply because they're on the bottom side and working our way upward. Then when we get to the PMX2, we're going to be connecting the front and rear RCA outputs of the radio to the amplifier harness RCA connections. We are not utilizing any of the speaker connectors that are on the PMX2 radio harness in this particular install. The last thing we'll install is the actual PMX2 radio harness itself. Once those connections are made, we'll be able to insert the dash kit into the dash and mount it using the 2 factory screws that we removed earlier on. Once that's done, we're ready to move on to the next step. Alright, so now that we have the last of the connections made and the dash kit and radio are now mounted, we're ready to make the final power and ground connections at the battery. Now once Brad gets this done, we'll be able to fire the system up, test it, and really finally do the tuning on the amplifier. So now with all the connections made, we're ready to check out the audio system. With the radio fired up and the amplifier on, we need to go ahead and make the final settings of the amplifier. First thing that we want to do is go ahead and set the input and crossover switches to their appropriate position. Now, this amplifier is a 4-channel amplifier, but it has an input switch in the event you're using only 2 channels of input. Since we are using all 4 channels, we want to make sure that that switch is positioned in the 4-channel position. Next, the crossover switches. The front are considered high pass, so we want to make sure that that switch is in our HP position, and the rear, which is running the subwoofer, is going to be low pass or in the LP position. For the crossover adjustments, we want to set both of those at approximately 80 Hertz. Simply rotate those around to the approximate position on the dial. The next 2 dials above it are for the punch EQ. Since this is an open air vehicle, we're going to leave those turned all the way counterclockwise or down, as it won't have very much effect in this application. Lastly, we want to adjust the output level controls or gain controls of the amplifier. To do this, we need to turn the volume of the radio up until we begin to see the input clip indicator light glow red. Once we see it turn on, we'll turn the volume down 1 notch at a time until it goes completely out. Then we will turn the front and rear output level controls up until we see the output clip indicator turn blue or bluish purple color. Since we're utilizing music for this setting, we'll expect to see that blue-purple light. Once we see it, we know the gains are set properly, and we're ready to move on from there. Alright, so now that we have the system tested and tuned, we're ready to move on with the cleanup of the wire. Now, of course, we're going to install different zip ties, and in fact, we've included some special zip ties in with the kit. Brad, tell us a little bit about those.
So we've included these special zip ties with the Christmas tree attached for the center driveline area. There's a couple holes from the factory that these fit right into and will allow you to zip tie the wires out of the way of the drive shaft.
And once we have all the wires zip tied up and out of the way, we can go ahead, reassemble the vehicle, and get it back out on the road. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps it up for this install. As you can see, it was pretty straightforward and easy to do. So Brad, before we get out of here, anything you'd like to add?
Now remember, as always, if you have any questions before, during, or after your install, give us a call. We'd be more than happy to help you out.
All right, well, with that, wraps this up. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in another installation video.